The United States should never use torture at any time for any reason, including in an attempt to prevent terrorist attacks. The first reason is that torture is immoral. Sometimes people will justify it in a sort of utilitarian type of argument, saying that, well, it's bad, but it's for the greater good. Well, first of all, utilitarianism has some very, very serious counterexamples. So if your justification is utilitarianism, then you have to account for all of those counterexamples. For example, according to utilitarianism, it would be just or it would be ethical to torture people who weren't actually guilty if somehow that were able to prevent terrorist attacks. Say if you were to torture the terrorist family, their children, people that they know, just to get them to give in. That would be moral according to utilitarianism. Not only that, but actually if it led to a greater amount of pleasure for a greater number of people, utilitarianism would be committed to the idea that you would actually have to let the attack happen if in fact it led to a greater amount of overall pleasure. But of course, that's just crazy. and really, utilitarianism itself is basically the egoism of the masses, the egoism of the majority. So utilitarianism has some very, very serious problems. It's not really a great theory to use as your defense. Torture is not part of just war theory. I don't think that it ever could be part of just war theory. It can't be considered a just war tactic. And I'm a believer in just war. I think that, they have this saying, all's fair in love and war, but I don't really agree with that. I think that even in love and war, there are still certain rules that you need to follow. And certain tactics, certain war tactics are just never morally permissible, such as rape and mass genocide. Now, maybe you could terrorize a population into surrendering, and it might be effective in terms of a tactic to do something like that, but that doesn't make it ethical. I still believe that it's a horribly immoral thing to do, even if it is effective. So, oftentimes people will critique the use of torture because it's ineffective. I think that has some legitimacy because people are going to say whatever they need to just to get it to stop. But even if it was effective, it still wouldn't be ethical to do. It's never going to be something that is going to, say, help you to end the conflict. And that's a big part of just war theory is you shouldn't be doing things that is going to further inflame the situation and make things worse and make it harder to be reconciled. You should only fight and defend yourself when you absolutely have to, and you have to do you have to do it in a certain way. And I believe that is accurate. That's true. Another thing people will point out is, well, sometimes the other side's going to do it to us. And maybe they will, but that's why they're the bad guys and we're the good guys. Do we really want to become like them? I hope that we don't. Another big reason, and actually my biggest worry with the use of torture, is that I believe that it goes against our core principles, the things that make America great. The Constitution itself bans torture, and I believe that the Founding Fathers had good reason to do that. So where it specifically bans torture is the Eighth Amendment. So the Eighth Amendment says excessive bail should not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. So you can't have cruel and unusual punishments, and you also especially couldn't have cruel and unusual punishments before the person has actually been convicted. So this is true even after they've been convicted of wrongdoing, let alone if you just pick them up, say, for questioning, and you wanted to find information or see whether they were guilty. You definitely wouldn't be able to use it in that fashion to try to elicit confessions and so forth. Other constitutional rights that are related to this issue, where I feel that with the law regarding terrorism, people are not given these rights. They have a right to a speedy and fair trial. People have been stuck in Guantanamo Bay now, Cuba, for 18 years, and they haven't had a trial. You have the right to face one's accusers, a right to an attorney. You have a right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. These are all the beliefs that we have in the Bill of Rights, as discussed in the Bill of Rights, that we think are very, very important. as a society, as the United States. And we're not following this when it comes to torture cases and terrorism cases. Now, one trick that they used, say, during the Bush administration is they claimed, well, none of those things apply because these people are just enemy combatants. So they didn't want to call them enemy soldiers because then they would have been committed to the Geneva Conventions, which prohibits torture and certain types of treatment for enemy soldiers. So they didn't want to call them enemy soldiers. They also wanted to say, well, they're not U.S. citizens, so the Bill of Rights doesn't really apply to them. We're just going to call them enemy combatants. And by calling them enemy combatants, you basically are making the legal argument that none of these things really apply to them. Well, this is a pretty clever legal tactic, just to try to make the argument that these agreements, these international agreements and so forth that you've made doesn't really apply, but it really doesn't do anything to change the moral argument. I mean, everybody knows this is just a sort of a little legal loophole or trick that you're trying to pull to redefine definitions. And by the way, just as an aside, they also redefined what the word torture meant as well. According to the Bush administration, it was intentional organ failure, which basically means that it's impossible to be guilty of torture because even if you accidentally killed somebody, then you could always say, well, it wasn't intentional. And of course, organ failure is death. So think about all the things you could do to them without having it count as intentional organ failure. If you poked out their eyes, if you sexually assaulted them, if you cut off their leg, none of those things presumably would cause intentional organ failure. So according to the Bush administration, that's not torture. Of course, that's ridiculous. By any reasonable person's definition, what they were doing was torture. In fact, one detainee actually lost an eye during this whole process. So I'm not sure what exactly they were doing to him. But it does count as torture, and waterboarding would count as torture. But they did other things as well, including sexually humiliating them and all sorts of crazy, odd things like that. Even things like feeding them through the rectum when it's not really medically necessary. This is not a joke here. This is not like a frat party or something. This is serious. And it really bothers me that they're doing all this sort of humiliation kind of stuff as well as physical pain. Listen, I know these are bad people, or at least if they're guilty, they're certainly bad people. I believe that they're war criminals because they don't follow just war theory either. They attack non-combatants. They attack children. They attack people who don't have anything to do with the things that they're upset about. So I believe that they're war criminals and they should be tried as war criminals. But the Constitution says that even those accused of very serious crimes have rights. And we have to honor that. We have to follow constitutional principles. To further go along with this idea that, that somehow these things don't apply just because they're not U.S. citizens, or some of them aren't, we have the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these. I'll let you take a look at them on your own. But just notice the first words in all of these things. Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. No one, everyone, no one. Obviously, this is supposed to apply to all people everywhere. It's not just the citizens of one nation or the citizens of the United States. And we had a huge role in getting this passed. I mean, this was really our influence that was the organizing principle for all of this. In fact, this Declaration of Human Rights is really very close to the Bill of Rights, in our Constitution. Very, very similar in a number of areas. It's obviously meant to apply to all people everywhere. And really, if you think about it, isn't this an absurd argument? The idea that if they're not a U.S. citizen, then we ought to just presume that the Constitution doesn't apply to them? Does that mean that somebody from Canada, if they commit a crime, suddenly they don't have access to their Miranda rights, they wouldn't have access to an attorney, they could be tortured and held forever and so on? I mean, That's absurd. The idea that if they're a French citizen, a citizen of France, or a citizen of Canada, or a citizen of anywhere else, that suddenly the U.S. Constitution doesn't apply to them. I really don't think that's what the Founding Fathers had in mind. I think the idea is all human beings, and in fact Jefferson said that, that all human beings are born with certain inalienable rights. So, regardless of their citizenship, they're still going to have the same rights, and the United States government has to respect that, no matter what citizens they are they are of, right? No matter what country they are citizens of. And in fact, the United States is actually founded upon John Locke's philosophy. In fact, so much so that it's often called the Great Lockean Experiment. And we can further see this by looking at John Locke's view of these things as well. So Locke's natural rights were life, liberty, health, and possessions, or in other words, property. And he believed that these rights were God-given and something that all people possessed, very similar to what Jefferson said. So a lot of these protections in the Bill of Rights are based upon Locke's idea of natural rights. You can also get an idea of what the Founding Fathers had in mind when you think about some of these anti-federalist worries that many of them had. So what they really didn't want is they didn't want the government to become a kingship. They didn't want it to be a dictatorship. They'd lived under that, seen the problems with it, and they were really worried that if you had a strong central government, that would lead to a dictatorship. And that's why for a long time they just had this kind of loose confederation of states, because they were really worried that if you have that central governing body, that it's going to lead to tyranny, basically. And these concerns then led to the Bill of Rights, as well as the idea of the separation of powers, that's going to keep things in check. It's going to keep somebody from taking over and becoming a dictator. And I believe that these same worries are just as legitimate today as they've ever been. One of the things that we've seen is democracy has kind of taken a step back here in recent times. A lot of these countries abroad that did have democracy, it seems like it's falling apart. And it makes me think that I'm not sure that democracy is an inherently stable form of government. It seems to be somewhat unstable. And I think the reason is that once a strongman dictator type has power, then he oftentimes wants to expand on that power, and he's going to want to take full control of everything. So it's kind of unnatural in a way for somebody who has a strong advantage, who has control of a government, to then stop and not try to take full control of the government. That's not the way most of these people work. Just their nature is not like that. They want to have control of everything. They want to have control of the economy, of the media. They don't want anybody to be able to say anything bad about them, so there's no free speech. That's what they really want, and so they're always looking to expand their power. And because of that, I'm not sure that democracy is a very stable form of government in a lot of ways, and you got to work at it to make sure that it remains stable. So I believe that these concerns are just as legitimate now as they've ever been. I believe that the anti-federalists were right on a lot of fronts. Not to say that we shouldn't have a central government. We have to have a central government just so that there's order. We got to have state governments. We got to have local governments and so on. But you've got to be very, very careful that you put strong limits on that government to make sure that the people in charge and people in power don't take over. So, I mean, the very worst case scenario that we all sort of fear is the Big Brother scenario, right? Where the president declares a state of emergency after a real or contrived terrorist attack that gives him or her broad emergency powers. And by the way, I read a story on The Atlantic about the president's emergency powers during a state of emergency, and it is terrifying. I can't believe Congress passed that. But oftentimes, as long as there's a majority of senators and members of the House that are the same party as the president, they'll pretty much let the president do whatever he or she wants. So I'm very worried about the state of emergency. To me, it seems extremely unconstitutional. I can't believe that it hasn't been overturned. Maybe it's just never been challenged, but it is unconstitutional, some of the things that they're saying that a president could do during a state of emergency. Nevertheless, that's what the law says. So, under this hypothetical worst-case scenario, constitutional and civil liberties would be temporarily suspended. They'll tell you it's temporary, but it won't be. Then political rivals, reporters, those within government who refuse to comply are then killed or imprisoned and tortured. They confess to committing the alleged crimes because of the torture. They finally break. And then this justifies their imprisonment and execution. And through this process, just through violence and intimidation, the U.S. becomes a police state run by a dictator. Now, maybe this seems far-fetched to you. Maybe you're thinking, oh, that's crazy, that would never happen. But it has happened in other places in the world. Look at the Middle East. President Erdogan in Turkey. There's an assassination attempt on him, and he's used that to crack down in the harshest way you can imagine. Vladimir Putin assassinates people even when they're abroad, when they say things that are contrary to what he wants. The Chinese government, they arrest people for saying what they say are falsehoods about the government, but really they're probably not falsehoods. They're just things that the government doesn't want them to say. So you look all across the world, and this kind of stuff has happened. Even the Nazi takeover of Germany, that Germany was a democracy when this happened. So if you think that this can't happen, then you're wrong. It has happened over and over. Now, maybe you think it's far-fetched to think that it would happen here. I think that it would be harder to make it happen here because we've got such a long history of democracy and demonstration and all that kind of stuff, but it's not impossible. If you told somebody that a week before the Soviet Union collapsed that it was going to collapse, I'm sure they would have thought you were crazy. If you told somebody, a week before Hitler started rounding up Jewish people, I'm sure they would have thought, and a lot of them did think, that there was no way that would happen. And because of that, they weren't able to leave in time. I'm sure if you'd asked Japanese people before the attack on Pearl Harbor, whether they thought that they would ever be rounded up and put in essentially concentration camps, I'm sure they wouldn't have thought that that would happen. So, sometimes we're kind of complacent because we think, oh, that kind of thing could never happen. Well, it's unlikely, but it could happen, and we need to take it seriously. The second worst case scenario, which maybe is probably more likely to happen, would be that we would just kind of slowly drift into a police state where everything is monitored, everything is controlled, there's no longer a recognition of the rights of citizens. And I feel like this is kind of happening, actually, right now. So in this case, the Constitution is honored in speeches of political leaders, but it's no longer followed in practice. They don't really respect it and follow what the Constitution actually said. And the problem here is that the country's core values are eroding. It's just, it's like we're kind of losing our soul. It really drives me crazy when I see these movies where you'll have a terrorist, a supposed terrorist, and they try to ask for their lawyer, and then the hero says, "You don't understand how this works," and they start beating the daylights out of him or something. And this is supposed to be heroic. This is supposed to be a good thing. Whereas to me, it just makes me think, man, where am I living? I can't believe people are in favor of this, that they don't see the danger of it. So, if that's the case, then yeah, we would continue to exist as the United States, but in name only. We wouldn't be the same country because we don't have the same standards. We don't have the same rights. I mean, the thing that makes America great is, and makes us unique, so different from other places in the world. And there are places in Europe and some of our allies who also have this to a certain extent. But the thing that makes us special is that we do have rights as private citizens, and it's not really like that in most places in the world. If we lose that, then we lose a lot of what makes America good. So if we want to keep Big Brother at bay, then we need to recognize what torture is often used for. It's used to intimidate political rivals and other so-called elites. Oftentimes these dictators will pacify the general public, but then they will be really, really harsh on the elites, people who are very wealthy and high up in government and so on, because they don't want to, they don't want any rivals to challenge them. It's often used to intimidate people to stop free speech, maybe on reporters, on anybody who's a critic. It's used to intimidate the general public. It just makes people so fearful that they don't dare mess with a government. It's used to elicit false confessions. That was oftentimes what happened during the Middle Ages. They just didn't like them, and so they would arrest them, and they could torture them into falsely confessing to some crime, and then they had them, and they could do terrible things to them, or they could kill them. So it's obviously blatantly false to have confessions like that, but it's still oftentimes used. And really, torture is a form of terrorism itself. They used to show people the instruments during the Middle Ages before they started torturing them, and oftentimes they'd get them to beg and try to do whatever they needed to do to pacify the people who were in power, to keep that from happening. But basically, it's a form of terrorism itself. So how can we use that as a tool to fight terrorism? It's like we're becoming the thing that we hate. So what can we do about it? Well, I believe that there should be 0% chance that we could ever have a Big Brother kind of government. And the way that would happen is to just follow the Constitution. I mean, the remedy is right there. We don't have to invent anything new. All we have to do is actually follow what's in there, because they already thought about all of this. And if we just did what it said, then you couldn't ever have a Big Brother kind of government. For example, in the story, 1984, they're able to arrest people, they're able to monitor people. And just think about this. We now have the technological capability for private businesses and the government, if they want to watch everything that we do. They can do that now. Once that capability is there, somebody's probably going to use it. So we can't get rid of the technology. I mean, the technology is here, the technology is going to stay. There's nothing we can do about that. All we can really do is have a renewed focus on civil liberties, on privacy, and make sure that technology is not abused. And if it is abused, then it needs to be like any other crime. People need to be going to jail. People need to get serious fines. It needs to be punishable just like any other crime would be. That's the only hope. That's the only way that it's going to happen. And it has to have teeth. It can't just be something that you say. There has to be an actual enforcement of the rule. If you did that, then there is no chance that we could ever drift into a Big Brother type of government. Because if the Big Brother government would have had to give people a lawyer, if they wouldn't have been allowed to torture people, if they wouldn't have been allowed to monitor everything that a person does without warrants, if they had all of those things, then they wouldn't be able to intimidate people the way that they were and break people down. So that's what we need. So I believe that these things need to be enforced. I think President George W. Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney, they should have been impeached for using torture, for violating the Constitution. Listen, following the Constitution is not optional. It's not just up to the discretion of the president whether he can torture somebody. He has to follow the Eighth Amendment unless the Eighth Amendment has been repealed by another amendment. And listen, that can happen. I mean, we did that with Prohibition. There was a constitutional amendment, and then we repealed it with another amendment. But until that happens, then he has to follow the Eighth Amendment. And if he doesn't, then he's broken the Constitution. And the Constitution is there specifically to make sure that the president can't violate certain things, that he can't violate the rights of citizens. That's the whole point, is to make sure that there's a check on specifically the president and the president's administration and the entire government. That's the whole purpose of it. So violating the Constitution in this way is, I think, the highest of high crimes. It is an impeachable offense. He violated the most sacred trust that he could be given. As the president is supposed to protect the Constitution against enemies, both foreign and domestic. Well, he is the enemy if he's breaking the Constitution himself. He should have been impeached. And I believe that the members of the CIA and other government officials who carried out the torture, they should be prosecuted and sent to prison. They violated international law. They violated U.S. law. They should be prosecuted for that crime. But you know, the only person who's ever been prosecuted for anything related to torture is John Kirikow. And he is a whistleblower who worked for the CIA, who was the first person to admit and have proof that the CIA was using torture tactics. Now, what he was convicted for was disclosing classified information. But the way that this happened was that, so he leaked the information to a reporter, and in order to verify the story and make sure that he was really telling the truth, the reporter asked for the name of the CIA agent who had committed the torture. And so John Kirikow gave the reporter the name. Now, the reporter didn't publish it. It wasn't published. It wasn't known publicly. It was just so that the reporter could verify that, yes, this story was true. And for that, he got 2 years in jail. So what the government is saying, basically, is that they don't care if you torture somebody. All they care about is don't tell anybody about it. This happens time after time with whistleblowers. They claim that they care, that they that they want people to come forward if they have information and so on, and then when they do, they're punished for it. So actions speak louder than words. According to our government, it's worse to tell people that torture is occurring and that the CIA is lying, rather than to actually do the torture. Now, I know they don't want to prosecute them because they don't want the political fallout. A lot of people would be opposed to that. They need to do it. If you think that you're protecting the United States by using torture, then you are so severely wrong. And I'm sure there probably are some people who are sincerely of that opinion, but they couldn't be more wrong, because they are violating the Constitution. And that is a terrible, terrible wrong that you are committing. We need to enforce this. I really admire John Kirikow. He was willing to make a personal sacrifice to do what was right. And so, you know, it's not so simple as to just say, oh, well, everybody in the CIA is bad. I don't think that. I know there are good people in government, but they need to stand up to this kind of stuff, and then we, the people, need to support them. Because if we don't, then they end up being punished, and it sends a message to everybody else in government that is really, really negative. We've got to stop this as voters. You can't vote for politicians who support this. We have to understand that the Constitution, following the Constitution, is not optional. And if they want to protect us, and I'm glad that they want to protect us, but they have to stay within constitutional limits. Because if we create a big brother government, a police state to protect us from terrorism, then who protects us from the police state?